Hey guys, we're in week 3 of our covenant series. We're going to be looking at the covenant with Abraham this week. Last week we had a huge lesson that you guys said the students handled really well in discussion groups. They remembered a lot of what they'd just been taught, were able to regurgitate that. It seemed like they were tracking and understanding. Hopefully they can bring some of that over to this week. We'll be looking at the covenant with Abraham. We're going to look at how the Lord chose Abraham out of free sovereign grace. We'll look at the promises that God gives to Abraham and how they actually correspond with the 3 P's that we looked at last week. God's intention in humanity to have a people for himself dwelling in paradise, amongst whom he could dwell with his presence. So people, paradise, presence, we said that's going to come up over and over again in the rest of Scripture. And here's a great example. The promises made to Abraham are chiefly that he's going to give Abraham descendants, a people. He promises a land that's flourishing and important, a paradise, and he promises to bless Abraham, and we see that kind of fleshed out as we progress in the biblical story, as primarily that God will be present amongst the people of Israel to bless them, and he will eventually dwell in their midst. So we're going to look at that, and then we'll look at whether or not this covenant with Abraham is unconditional or conditional, and how we're supposed to understand that. So those are the things we'll go through in the lesson. I think that there's a lot less in terms of just sheer content coming out this week, but it would be a good idea for you guys to review. I didn't list a bunch of questions like I did last week. You can come up with those as you hear the lesson and go through those. Middle schoolers, that's a great idea. High schoolers, take it or leave it. Maybe that could be helpful. That got some students that are not usually involved to speak last week, so that was cool to see. High schoolers can definitely hit on question 2, whether anybody has specific things they want to dig deeper on, questions, anything they want to clarify, anything that was confusing to them. Middle schoolers would maybe just skip that question. The third question, I'll review those 3 P's of people, paradise, and presence at the beginning. I'll highlight how the promises made to Abraham are chiefly in those 3 categories, and then I'll again encourage them, you need to remember these and read the Bible through these lenses. It's not really an exaggeration to say that the majority of the rest of Scripture is concerned with how the Lord is going to fulfill those 3 promises to Abraham and to his descendants. And that starts right away. And so you guys can talk about this in discussion groups. Ask them, people that know Genesis well, which of those 3 promises, the 3 P's, is Genesis primarily concerned with? And people may have almost certainly have not thought about that too much, but those who know Genesis well maybe will be able to quickly realize it is chiefly concerned the rest of the way with the promise of people. Abraham's story, so see if you can get that answer out of them, and then I would walk through just the high points of the rest of Genesis and show how the book is really concerned with this promise and God's fulfillment of it. This is the majority of Abraham's story, is the tension of him being childless, even though the Lord has promised him descendants, and him and Sarah struggling to have kids, and then the Lord miraculously provides. And then we have the longest chapter in Genesis is Genesis chapter 24, where Isaac is finding a wife, and he finds a wife so that they can be fruitful and multiply. And then Rebekah is also barren for a short season. That doesn't give a lot of attention in the text, but they cry out to the Lord, and she again has miraculous children, Jacob and Esau. The narrative focuses primarily on Jacob. That's who receives the blessing. And Jacob fathers the 12 sons of Israel, who eventually become the 12 tribes. And even in those narratives, the final narratives of Genesis, it focuses on Joseph, who the Lord providentially sends ahead of his brothers and his family into the land of Egypt. He sovereignly raises him up to be second in command in Egypt, and all of this is so that Joseph's brothers, who are wicked and sold him into slavery, can be saved. He ends up storing up food in the famine, and his brothers and family come and ask for food, and he's able to eventually provide that for them and a place to live. And then we flip over to Exodus after all this talk about seed and the Lord making a people from Abraham. And you should read Exodus 1:6 is an awesome verse. Says, I deleted it off of my sheet. You have to go read it for yourself. Essentially says that this promise God made to Abraham has been fulfilled, that the people in Egypt are multiplying and they're filling the land just like the Lord commanded in the Garden of Eden. And then Exodus and the rest of the Torah go on to have a slightly different focus on some other aspects of the promises that God made to Abraham that we'll hit in the coming weeks of this series. Next question is a lot quicker. We see in Genesis 12, Genesis 15, the Lord is symbolized by a smoking fire pot and a flaming torch. So this fire and smoke is what symbolizes the Lord's presence. Ask them how they see this theme repeated over and over in the Old Testament, where places where the Lord is identified with fire and smoke. I've listed a couple. There's probably more that you guys could come up with or our students could come up with. That's a quick, easy question. Then the last two questions, you get to choose, if you're running out of time, whether you want to talk about divine election or about circumcision. So take your pick there. If you're blessed and you have enough time, maybe you'll get to hit on both election and circumcision. These are both tough topics. Middle schoolers, if you don't get there, that's okay. High schoolers, if you don't get there, that's okay. But these are good topics for us to hit on. So we're going to hit a lot on God's election and his free sovereign grace, that he's free to have mercy on whom he will have mercy. We'll hit on that a lot in the lesson, though I won't quote that verse. And you can just touch base with them. How does that make you feel? What do we make of this fact that God chooses Abraham? He could have chosen any idolater, pagan in the world at that time, and he chose Abraham, not because of anything in Abraham. Is that fair for God to just choose to have mercy on Abraham and not to have mercy on the other idolaters all around him? How do we talk about that? How do we understand that? That's a big question that students will have a variety of responses to. I would go and read this verse. It's quoted in the Old Testament, and then Paul requotes it in Romans 9, which is about divine election, where God says, this is how he defines himself: I will have mercy on whom I have mercy. And it appears in the biblical story that this is a big part of what it means for God to be God, that he is not obligated or constrained by anyone or anything. He's certainly not obligated by sinful people. No one forces his hand to do anything. He is free to show mercy on whom he will show mercy. No one deserves his mercy. No one earns his mercy, not even by an act of faith. The Lord must move in free, sovereign mercy in order for people to receive it. And that's what it means to be God, that he is in control. We're not in control. Last question, if you would prefer to talk about circumcision or if you have time. This is not a fun topic to talk about, but it is kind of important since we're in our covenant series. We looked last week at introduced this covenant sign reality. God gives the covenant sign of the rainbow or the war bow, as we talked about last week. This week in the covenant with Abraham, we get a much less beautiful covenant sign of circumcision. But we said last week, God gives these covenant signs for a reason. They're not random. They're meant to symbolize spiritual realities. They're meant to point to certain things. And so what does circumcision point to? What is it supposed to be signifying? I've got a couple of things listed for you here. Honestly, it's kind of a difficult one. People have different opinions. There are lots of suggestions that get thrown out. Likely it has multiple different things that it's symbolizing and pointing to. Definitely explicit in the text in Genesis 17 is the fact that those who do not submit to circumcision or don't circumcise their children under the Abrahamic covenant will be cut off from their people, cut off from the Lord. And so that's a clear sign that it points to, that if you don't cut off in circumcision, you will be cut off from the people. A lot of people also would lean into the opposite side, so that's the negative. The positive side is it's meant to be a symbol of cutting off sin and corruption, and we can see that even more clearly as the Lord says we need to circumcise our hearts. Moses says that later in the Torah, and the Lord hits on that throughout the Old Testament. Some say it's a signifier and a pointer that salvation comes through pain and through bloodshed, that's the only way to achieve salvation. Not that the act of circumcision is saving them, but that's type of what's to come, that's how salvation will be accomplished. It's certainly a sign of faith. Abraham has to have great faith to go and circumcise himself when he's over 100 years old. Or at 100 years old. He's got to believe that the Lord really is who he says he is, and that's kind of repeated throughout the generations. It's a sign of faith, an act of faith. Lastly, an interesting one is some people even say in Egypt, they circumcised the priests in Egypt, and Abraham would have gone down to Egypt, and the people of Israel have a close association with Egypt, so they would have known this. And by having all of the males circumcised, it kind of signifies that the Lord is creating a kingdom of priests in the nation of Israel, which is what he'll later call them in the Torah, that all of God's people are meant to be priests in some sense. So a lot of possibilities there for what circumcision can point to. Again, it probably points to several of those. But yeah, have fun on Sunday discussing these topics. I'm sorry, we just, got to faithfully ask the questions that need to be asked. So I'll see you guys on Sunday. Thanks for all you do.